wish you were here at the Etowah Depot Museum to learn how a small southern town and a large railroad company grew up together.
Good afternoon. I'm Adam Meyer from the program in Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this session of the Southern Festival of Books, Learning from the Masters. The masters in this case being Emily Dickinson, Robert Stone, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and William Melvin Kelley. We have four really interesting authors today to talk about these other writers: Martha Ackmann, Madison Smartt Bell, Kirk Curnutt, and Anthony Reid, respectively. I will introduce each of them briefly. They will talk with us for a little while, and then we'll all get together for some Q&A at the end. So first up is Martha Ackmann, author of Curveball and the Mercury 13. She writes about women who have changed America. The recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship, Ackmann taught a popular seminar on Emily Dickinson at Mount Holyoke College and lives in Western Massachusetts. And this is her book, let me hold it up there, These Fever Days, 10 Pivotal Moments in the Making of Emily Dickinson. So Martha.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam, very much. And hello to Kirk and Madison and Anthony, who are going to be coming on next. And to all of you out there, it's a pleasure to be with the Southern Festival of the Books. Well, I should say that to give you a little introduction to my book on Emily Dickinson, it was a very long time in coming. I have thought about Dickinson and taught Emily Dickinson for many, many years. And they could never quite figure out what kind of tack to take on doing a biography of Dickinson. Certainly there are many cradle to grave biographies of Emily Dickinson out there, and I didn't want to do that because there are some very, very fine ones. I didn't want to replicate it, but I really wanted to stylistically do something a little bit different with Dickinson. So actually, this idea for focusing in on 10 pivotal days came from my teaching. As Adam mentioned, for almost 20 years, I taught a seminar for Mount Holyoke College in Emily Dickinson's house, in the very rooms where she created her poetry. Mount Holyoke is not that far from Amherst, Massachusetts, just 11 miles, where Dickinson was born and raised. And I noticed that my students sort of focused in more intently when I concentrated the day's lesson around a particular moment in Dickinson's life. And so that was kind of the spark that came to me, that once I realized that the students were engaged by that approach, I thought I could use the same kind of angle to do this book on Dickinson. And so it does not purport to be a cradle to grave biography. Rather, I focus on 10 pivotal moments, we've been calling them, in Dickinson's life where something changed, where she was different at 10 o'clock in the morning than she was at 10 o'clock at night, that it might be a letter she received, it might be a visitor who came by, it might be an action she took, it might be an action she didn't take. The days are chronological. The first one is when she's 14 and I hear her literary voice for the first time. I hear the Dickinson that we become familiar with in her poetry for the first time. The next day is when she's a student at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, the seminary that eventually became the college, and on until the day she dies. So chronological, but not consecutive. I tried to give a sense through that approach of her evolution as a poet. You know, for being arguably America's greatest literary recluse, Dickinson left a trail of clues about her life. First of all, there are the poems, 1,789 poems that she worked on, that she rewrote throughout her 55 years. Now, poems are not autobiographical. They are a work of art. Dickinson once famously said, "When I state myself as the representative of the verse, it is not me, but a supposed person." She was, I think, really arguing for the primacy of the imagination there. But the poems nevertheless give us a window into what she's interested in, what she spends time thinking about. And then there are her letters. Dickinson wrote over 1,000 letters that we have. Scholars estimate that that's probably about 1/10 of the letters that she actually wrote. The rest have been lost to history, or they're in barns or attics somewhere in New England or elsewhere. And then there's all the contextual information, what she read, who her friends were, how she spent her days, what was going on around town, the weather reports for the days in which Dickinson lived. Actually, that's kind of an interesting story. There was a kind of eccentric guy named Ebenezer Snell who lived a mile from Emily Dickinson, who kept a very detailed weather journal. He was a professor at Amherst College for many, many years, so that we know what the weather was like on every single day she lived, the snow that fell, the parhelions that were around the sun on particular days. That proved to be quite a boon for me. And I really wanted to show Dickinson not as an artifact in amber, as she often is, as this kind of fragile moth of Amherst, as she was called, but rather as a living and breathing extraordinary woman. And most importantly, I wanted to excavate her interior life, because I write narrative nonfiction, which means I bring the techniques of storytelling, setting and place and character to tell a true story. Everything must be true. But I realized that when you're talking about Dickinson, you can't think about action in the same way that you would with, say, a baseball player, somebody that I had written about before writing this Dickinson book, because action for Emily Dickinson is thought. So it really did create a unique way and a challenge for me, really, to read Dickinson's letters, for example, not so much for what she was doing, but for what she was thinking. I lived near Amherst, Massachusetts. As I said, I taught at Mount Holyoke College for many, many years, which is just across the notch, as we say, across the mountain from where Dickinson lived. So I know an awfully lot about this world that she lived in. If I turn my computer a little bit here, you'd see the railroad tracks that run right by my house that Emily's father, Edward Dickinson, brought into town. So I really tried to tap into a lot that I know about this area, and into my friends and neighbors who were able to give me a lot of help as well. For example, there's a scene at the beginning of one of the chapters where Dickinson just returns home after being in the Boston area, being treated for an eye disorder. And she went up into the attic to read Shakespeare as loud as she could. She had been prevented from reading. And I called up my friends at the Emily Dickinson Museum and said, can I get up there? Can I get in the attic? Can I see what it looks like? Can I look at the light? Can I hear what the echo sounds like? And so I tried to bring those kind of elements of verisimilitude to the book. I'll just say one final thing and then hand it off to Kirk. And that is that I think there are a couple of things that are new about the Dickinson that I reveal in these fevered days. One is that she was a lot more connected to the world than we had previously thought. I think she's more ambitious than we have given her credit to. And I think that she was a woman who really knew her own mind. She was often given suggestions on how to improve her poems that she never took. And I think that says something about her strength and something about her ambition as well. So I'll leave it at that and pass it back to Adam and then to Kirk. Thank you. I look forward to our discussion later on.
Great. Thank you, Martha. I look forward to hearing more from you later on as well. So next up is Madison Smartt Bell, who is best known for his trilogy of novels about Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, including All Souls Rising, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and the PEN/Faulkner Award. He is the author of numerous books of fiction and nonfiction, professor of English at Goucher College, and is here to talk to us about, let me get it in here, Child of Light, his new biography of the author, Robert Stone. So Madison, take it away.
Thanks, Adam. There was another book involved in this package. In fact, two. One is a Library of America edition of 3 of Stone's best novel, and the other is a book called The Eye You See With, which is selected nonfiction of Robert Stone. I'm going to read a little pastiche of different things, but mostly from the introduction to the nonfiction book, in which I had to do the biography much more efficiently than in the Doubleday book. All American novelists are embarked on a search for meaning. Robert Stone conducted his version of the quest in a style and within a structure uniquely his own. We assume, too, that our writers are products of their origins. Stone's origins were obscure, his childhood difficult, his youth quite seriously dangerous. A weaker, less talented and intelligent person would not have survived those circumstances, much less prevailed in the way that Stone did, as a great artist and as a pellucid, unflinching observer and analyst of the time in which he lived. And I'm going to cut to a little analytic part that is at the end of the introduction to that book. During the last movement of A Flag for Sunrise, one of the principals, adrift in an open boat, has a hallucinatory dream in which a couple of sharks tell each other a sort of joke. "What is there?" the shark asked his companion. "Just us," the other shark said. Take away the bitter irony, and it might be seen as the statement of a secular humanist, one who believes in nothing beyond the realm of human interaction, or as the same character says in the same sequence, we have nothing but each other. And I'm going to now cut to what you might call the money shot. This is from an interview I did with a writer called Patty Marks, and I was reading over the first draft of it, and I thought, oh, look, I've written the elevator pitch for Stone's importance as a novelist. Stone had a compulsion to make each of his novels express the gestalt of being an American in the world at the time of the writing. And he succeeded very well in doing that in his masterpiece novels Through Damascus Gate. So those books become part of the historical record. That is, if you want to know what American life was like in the 1980s, Children of Light will tell you. But they're also very much part of the now of the time they were written. Most importantly, his novels show us how we got where we are from the civil rights struggle through the Vietnam War, all the way to September 11th, 2001, which is predicted in a general way by Damascus Gate. And all that work is colored by the suspicion that our 18th century institutions might fail us, along with our moral fiber, as they have now done. Stone's work in aggregate is predictive of a state of cultural decadence and political degeneracy into which we have collapsed. It's a chronicle, somewhat like Gibbon's chronicle of the decline of ancient Rome, only ours has happened a lot faster. And I guess I could point out the relevance of this to today, yesterday, next week, and next month, but I don't think I really have to. So I'll pass the mic to the next person. Cheers.
Great. Thank you. Looking forward to hearing more from you later on. So next up is Kirk Curnutt, who is the executive director of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society and the managing editor of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Review. Lovely picture of F. Scott over your shoulder there. And professor of chair of English at Troy University. Curnutt is the author of the Cambridge Introduction to F. Scott Fitzgerald, among other books, and the editor of the Oxford Historical Guide to F. Scott Fitzgerald. He's here to talk about a new collection he's edited of Scott's Montgomery Stories to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the marriage of Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald. Kirk.
Great, thank you. Well, as Adam says, I have to be honest, I feel a little illegitimate being on this panel with my co-presenter, since I did not actually write this entire book. I just wrote the introduction. But it is a collection of a trilogy of stories that aren't very well known. Just about everybody goes through the experience of reading The Great Gatsby and perhaps Tender as the Night. But F. Scott Fitzgerald also wrote, over the course of 20 years, nearly 180 short stories, very few of which get any attention whatsoever. So last year about this time, as we were looking for ways to locally celebrate the anniversary of not only Scott and Zelda's wedding last March, the 100th anniversary, but also the centenary of his career, I spoke with publisher here, New South Books in Montgomery, in the hopes of putting together these three stories: The Ice Palace, The Jelly Bean, and The Last of the Bells. And it's very important. They're very important stories to me personally, because they really do deal with Montgomery, Alabama, which is where I've lived for 30 years. For 25 of those years, I taught at Troy University, and my office was downtown, so I could step out my back door and look up a hill right to the opening of Pleasant Avenue, which is where Zelda's family home stood. It was always a great honor of mine to be able to take people around to different sites in downtown Montgomery. But I was also very aware that Montgomery, Alabama is a historically tragic city. It's a city of juxtapositions. It's marketed as both the cradle of the Confederacy and the birthplace of civil rights. And the Fitzgeralds really did not necessarily have a place in tourism or even in literary studies throughout Alabama. So we designed this book in hopes of changing that. One thing I want to point out is that if you come to Montgomery and you try to take a tour of the Fitzgerald site, there is now, right at the opening of Pleasant Avenue, the National Lynching Memorial that opened up just 2.5 years ago. And this juxtaposition for me is really puts these stories and puts that history in context. Most people know the story, most literary fans know the story of how F. Scott Fitzgerald came down to Montgomery, Alabama, fell in love with this Southern belle, was thrown over because he was not wealthy, went home to Minnesota, wrote a novel, sold it, came back down, was able to marry the girl. What people don't realize is when that happened in 1919, that was during what was known as Red Summer, when there were race riots all over America. And as the Lynching Memorial makes powerfully clear, there were also incidents in Montgomery going on at that same time, including the murder of three men in two separate incidents. So as I was doing the introduction, I not only wanted to say that these stories are important as part of the Fitzgerald legend, which I sometimes think gets overplayed, but it's a story about the need to sort of acknowledge within literary history of the Fitzgeralds the importance of race in these settings in which a lot of his fiction takes place. We struggle in Fitzgerald studies with the fact that our author was not on the right side of history, that he was not racially progressive, and that the representation of African Americans throughout a lot of his work is derogatory. And so, to me, the juxtaposition of those two spaces really opens up a chance not to reconcile them, but to really have a conversation about that juxtaposition, and just to celebrate literature I just want to conclude a little bit by talking about the experience of going through the Lynching Memorial. One of the things I do as a teacher is bring my students up from Troy, Alabama, which is where I teach now, and we go through the Lynching Memorial and we look up the real life people who inspired fictional victims of lynching in Faulkner and To Kill a Mockingbird and several other works. So it's a very important teaching tool. And as you walk out, there's a wonderful quote from Toni Morrison from Beloved. And as I tell my students, ask yourself why this particular site uses this passage from a fictional work as opposed to a piece of nonfiction oratory. So this book was really an effort to celebrate the Fitzgeralds, but open up a cultural conversation that I think in 2020, as we move forward with his centenary of his career, that it's very important for us to have. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kirk. That's fascinating perspective. Last up then is Anthony Reid, who is Associate Professor of English at Vanderbilt University. He's the author of Freedom Time, The Poetics and Politics of Black Experimental Writing, which analyzes some of the ways Black writers have engaged literary form to imagine new forms of aesthetic expression and political solidarity. His most recent book, Soundworks, Race, Sound, and Poetry in Production, studies recorded collaborations between poets and musicians within and beyond the Black Power era. And that book is forthcoming. Dr. Reid will be discussing the work of the late author William Melvin Kelley, whose work was recently reissued by Anchor Books. Kelley wrote 3 novels. Let me get them on here. A Different Drummer, Dem, and A Drop of Patience. So I'm interested to hear what Professor Reid has to say.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for having me. He actually also has another novel, his last, called Dunsford's Travels Everywheres. And because you won't believe that there's actually an S there, and so of course I've placed it where I can't reach it. Dunsford's Travels Everywheres is his most experimental work. Really explicitly, it begins with an epigraph from James Joyce and works through a kind of, parts of it are in a fictional language that blends Harlem slang and Bantu language structures. But what I wanted to focus on, because Kelley is talked about as a lost writer, especially after Catherine Schultz had the profile in the New Yorker, I thought it would be helpful to talk about my own relationship to Kelley just a little bit as a way into his work. And for that, I'll say that in addition to being a literary critic, I, at least at one point in my life, was an aspiring fiction writer. And as a doctoral student and doctoral candidate looking for writers to discuss in the dissertation that became the book Freedom Time, began to keep my ear open for who are some of the other writers who might have come before me. Because often enough in literature, in the formal study of literature in the university, it can be hard to find writers if their work goes out of print. So, and in the course of a couple of different conversations, William Melvin Kelley's name came up. And the first book of his that I encountered was his first novel, A Different Drummer. A Different Drummer tells the story of a fictional southern state where one day the main character, whose name is Tucker Caliban, decides to salt his field, burn his house, shoot his livestock, and leave town with his wife, who is pregnant, and their child. This sets off an exodus, a mass exodus across the state, where other African Americans decide that they too will follow Tucker Caliban's example, and if they don't destroy all of their belongings, they do decide to pick up stakes and to leave. The bulk of the novel is set in a small town in this fictional state. And what was off-putting about it to me, what I wasn't ready to receive, is the fact that it's narrated entirely or nearly entirely from the perspective of the white characters in town. There are vivid scenes describing white men's interaction on the porch at on the porch at the local store. There are scenes describing the descendants of those who had enslaved Tucker Caliban's ancestors. And those are the people around whom the novel turns. And when I encountered this in my 20s, looking for people to give me some example of what are the ways into writing about the richness and fullness, the complexity and variance of Black experiences that don't give ground to the idea of Blackness as pathology, Blackness as problem to solve, Blackness as a kind of social issue in the United States. Reading this book that was heralded to me, probably just the name was told to me, coming across this, I didn't quite know what to do with it. So I put it down. When I got the invitation to be a part of this panel, I received the book and I started reading it, and I realized now what I could not have realized then. The book is frankly brilliant. And it's brilliant, especially considered in its context. It was published in 1962, so right as the civil rights movement is in full swing, but before the assassination of Malcolm X in 1965, which was the event Kelley covered the trial for the Amsterdam News, where his father had been editor. That was the event that basically set in motion the series of events that led to Kelley's no longer writing. So 1962, 10 years after Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison's great novel of Black interiority, with its own critique of existing civil rights organization, you get this book, whose character Tucker Caliban has a critique of a thinly veiled National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And it has a veiled critique of the Nation of Islam through a character who, after having failed to organize a sort of interracial leftist organization, decides to form a thinly veiled Nation of Islam. What's brilliant about it and what I appreciate about it is, on the one hand, my dates are probably fuzzy. If it doesn't anticipate, it certainly is in the same stream as books like James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, and really takes the privilege, the vantage point, to say that, as Baldwin put it, and I'm paraphrasing, if Black people to this point have been observed, it is now they who get to observe and to take control of telling the stories, telling what they know of the white people that they've been around. So that's one level at which I can now truly appreciate this work and what it's trying to do. But the other thing that it does, read in the context of the civil rights movement, and especially read in the context of its critique of professional organizations like the NAACP and the Nation of Islam, it seems to me that Kelley must have been thinking very deeply about W.E.B. Du Bois's classic 1935-ish text, Black Reconstruction in America. In that text, which Du Bois wrote at the urging of people like Anna Julia Cooper to correct the record of what had emerged as the lost cause narrative, explaining the Civil War, Du Bois described the decision of enslaved Africans to leave their plantations as the Civil War raged as a general strike. What happened is, as news of the Civil War spread, and as the war itself spread, people who had been enslaved decided, we will no longer toil this way. They put down hammer and hoe and tools and implements, and they left in droves to join the Union camps. It threw the South into further turmoil, the Confederacy into further turmoil beyond what the war had already done. And that, I think, is what Kelley has in mind. In the course of his novel, rather than fighting, rather than pushing for integration, rather than thinking about bus boycotts and other things, for which we just heard Montgomery is one center, Nashville is another, where I am now, he just imagines, what if everyone just left? And the effect that he's able to imagine in a very just swiftly sketched scenes is all of the people who are dependent on, all of the poor whites who are dependent upon the very same family that had enslaved Tucker Caliban's family, they realize that they don't have any more leverage, that there's no way for them to really stand up to or fight the DeWitts, the family, and that nor are there enough of them to do the work that the now free Black people have been doing. So their only recourse is symbolic violence. They decide that when the leader of the Nation of Islam stand-in comes down to this town to figure out what's going on, they find him, they capture him, they torture him, and they lynch him. And that's the note on which the novel ends. It ends with a scene of symbolic violence of these people who recognize that they have no other card to play. In a short economical novel, a very confident first novel, and it should be said, the narrative, or excuse me, the story of the leader of this Nation of Islam stand-in, who attends Harvard and who quits Harvard within 6 months of graduating, directly echoes Kelley's own story. So there's something interesting there. But the recognition that part of what the violence that was then unfolding, that people were aware of and were seeing, that there was a symbolic function to that. For him at 24 years old, the age he was when he published the book, to have grasped that and then to have created the fictional form to present it in all of its grotesque absurdity, to present in all of the pathos and the limitations, the deep personal ties that connect the Caliban family and the DeWitts, the wealthy white family. It was a work that, in my mind, is really an answer to what Ellison is up to in Invisible Man. Kelley is known and throughout the rest of his career, the novels that follow, as a satirist, and there is a deep satirical element that runs through his work. But it's so that's one way to read him. He's often compared to people like Faulkner and to James Joyce. I think that looking at his epigraphs alone, which include, so Dunsford's Travels Everywhere has epigraphs from John Oliver Killens and Amos Tutuola. Amos Tutuola is the great Nigerian novelist who also published his first book, The Palm Wine Drinker, in the 1950s. John Oliver Killens publishes a few famous books, among them Cotillion, or One Good Bull is Worth the Whole Herd. They're running in circles parallel to what becomes known as the Black Arts Movement, which a critic named Larry Neal referred to as the sister to the Black Power concept. Kelley never calls for Black power explicitly, or the power that he calls for is the power of refusal. I'm almost done. And I'll say this, if we think of satire as a sort of, there's an irony to most satire. Irony tends to double the thing that it's talking about. And part of what Kelley's satire does, and all across his novels and short fiction, is ask us to think very carefully about what would it mean to just refuse altogether, to opt out, and what is on the other side of that journey, which he declines to depict in a different genre. And I'll wrap up there for now with gratitude to the organizers and to all of you for your time.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate your correcting my omission about Dunsford Travels Everywhere. Very, very interesting novel. Well worth attention that it doesn't get. So, so far, I would like to encourage the audience to write in questions. I don't know exactly what the procedure is, but I'm sure you do. We have gotten one question with Anthony. I think you already answered this question, but maybe the rest of you can speak to why you became interested in that particular author. The question says, came during Martha's talk. So it says, we are all drawn into Dickinson in our school years. We may know a few of her poems because of that, but what drew you to her, and what age and why? And the others of you can address that for your authors as well. Go ahead, Martha.
This is going to sound like I'm making it up, but I'm not. I read Dickinson for the first time when I was a kid in public school in St. Louis, where I grew up. I think I was a junior in high school and opened up one of those big tomes, the Literature of Our Nation or something like that. And I remember the poem that our teacher assigned to us. It was Dickinson's After Great Pain, a Formal Feeling Comes. It's a pretty weighty poem for a 16-year-old in high school. And I did that thing that kids everywhere do when they don't want to be called on. I kind of slid down in my chair because I couldn't explicate a single line of that poem. But here's what happened. Even though I couldn't explain it, I understood it on some level. And I think that has a lot to do with Dickinson's genius as a writer, that she is able to reach us in ways that hit our gut first before they hit our head. And I think it's fair to say that I've spent the years since that moment at McClure High School trying to understand that very breathtaking quality of Dickinson's work.
What about you, Kirk? I know you said you've lived in Montgomery for a long time. Are you from Montgomery?
Not originally, no, but I think like a lot of young men with literary aspirations, at some point you discover that myth and the notion of expatriation and all the different capitals of literature that he traveled to. It's almost irresistible. But a lot of my work with Fitzgerald came about because I did get a job here, and I also felt like Montgomery was kind of, in terms of literature, was kind of a great undiscovered place. It's where history sort of overshadows literature so much.
Madison, I know you and Robert Stone were friends. Did you know him as a writer before you knew him personally?
Yeah, I read his in 1983. I was on my way to Europe for the first time ever with my parents, as luck would have it, and I just published my first novel, and my mother handed me a paperback copy of A Flag for Sunrise to read on the plane, and it was good. It's pretty much used up a flight from Nashville to Rome. And by the time the plane had landed in Rome, I thought, this is the guy. I want to be this guy. I want to be this writer.
Interesting.
But so we didn't meet until, we met tangentially a couple of times in the 80s. He came to teach at Johns Hopkins in the mid-90s. I was teaching there then. We became friendly then. We hung out a bit, but he didn't stay at Hopkins long. He was out of there in probably 18 months, and didn't think I'd probably see him again. But Damascus Gate came out, and in reading Damascus Gate, I thought there was some Flag for Sunrise resonance in there too, but he had a sense of the third world that I thought made me think I really need to take this guy to Haiti. So I wrote him a note saying, hey, I was going to Haiti a lot then. I'd like to, we should go to Haiti together sometime. I didn't get much of an answer to that. And then maybe a year later, he said, oh, about going to Haiti, could we go next week? Almost. I think it was a month out. He wanted to go for Carnival, and I said, I'm not going to say no to you. So I set up a trip to Haiti for 6 days, and that going to Haiti with anybody is a bonding experience. So that was where we really began to become close friends.
Great. We do have another audience question specifically for you, Kirk. What is your favorite Fitzgerald novel? He is uneven in some ways. So do you feel like there's a novel where you can feel him pushing as a writer?
I think probably Tender as the Night is the novel that I really encourage people to experience. Like I said, everybody sort of at some point in their life encounters Great Gatsby, and Greil Marcus has a kind of fascinating and frustrating book about Gatsby that came out this year. But Tender is really one of those great ambitious novels that never quite pulls it together. But I'm also a big advocate of the short stories, and recently, recently am currently trying my hand at a podcast where we draw a random short story out of the hat and try and BS our way through saying something intelligent about it. But one of the things I was going to ask everybody else, and maybe a little trickier for Martha, but all of these writers are so associated with youth, and it's so difficult, I think, for writers to sustain careers the way that Stone did. I'm just wondering, at what point did each of these writers sort of feel, kind of limited by having early success? And again, Martha, you'll have to kind of twist that a little bit to wherever you want to take it. But
Anybody want to jump in?
I think
Go ahead, Anthony.
Fitzgerald was the.
I'm trying to help making it worse. Madison, go ahead.
I think the writer must. Let me start by saying that thank you, Anthony Reid, for introducing me to William Melvin Kelley. I mean, I feel as embarrassed as I did around 1983 when I realized I didn't know who Toussaint Louverture was. Okay, so you're doing a work of correction. I think that's very important. So I don't know anything about him, so I can't comment. I mean, Emily Dickinson's work seems to me not to be particularly useful or connected. That it's got this eternal quality. I mean, she did most of it, as most poets do, while she was in fact fairly young. Nor did she live that long. Comparing Stone to Fitzgerald would be an interesting thing to do because they had the same set of bad habits. Mm-hmm. But Stone, I don't think, ever had the illusions that Fitzgerald did. I mean, if Fitzgerald's tension with his own illusions is what produced the great work. Stone never had those illusions. He was a cradle Catholic and, always knew that he had a black heart and was going to end up a rotting corpse and then a skeleton. I think a lot of Fitzgerald's work is about fighting that idea and those possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Anthony, what were you going to say?
Well, I think I would say it's worth remembering that the reason I mentioned Kelley's association with the Black Arts Movement is in 1962, all of the emerging Black writers were quite young, including even people like James Baldwin were still young. And so there was just such a sense of possibility, of promise. And what happened to Kelley more than anything, as far as I can tell, is the pressures of living in the era got to be too much. He after covering the trial of Malcolm X's assassins, he and his wife and their children just left. They left the country, first for Paris and then eventually lived in Jamaica for a long time. And so before coming back in the 80s to teach at Sarah Lawrence and elsewhere, I think. So a lot of those writers just didn't make it out of the 60s. Right. Because it was an era when a lot of people may have survived, but mentally, the disillusionments that they faced and just the trauma that they lived through was such that they abandoned their aesthetic projects. So people like Sonia Sanchez or Mary Baraka or Nikki Giovanni are exceptions. But Kelley, he was just a tremendously productive for 10 years and then just seems to stop cold. Upon his death, he claimed that he had 2 novels that were not yet published, and I don't know what the state of those are. But I really think it's more the time he was living in and just the sharp disillusionment that he faced.
Yeah, and even some of the Black writers at that time who kept writing stopped getting read. I'm a big John A. Williams fan, and he kept writing and writing and writing, and nobody read him at all. Which leads me actually to the question I had for the panel, which was something that I find very interesting, and that is the sort of vicissitudes of literary status, who's up and who's down. Dickinson, of course, was completely unknown during her own lifetime, right? Almost completely. And so her reputation comes later. Fitzgerald is an odd case because he had a huge reputation, Then he kind of faded away, and then his reputation came back again. I would argue that Stone, although he's well known in literary circles, the average person on the street hasn't probably heard of him, or William Melvin Kelley. So I'm just wondering if you could make some comments about why it is that some writers hit, as it were, and others don't, or do at a different time.
Well, I'd say this about Dickinson, because not a lot of people know this, is that Dickinson wrote her first poem when she was in her early 20s. She wrote and she continued to revise and work on poems up until she was 50. She died at age 55. The thing that people don't realize is that while Dickinson wrote nearly 2,000 poems and published a handful, 10 or so during her lifetime, she had editors seeking her work. Her work was published anonymously, mainly in newspapers, but it's a myth to say that she wasn't known in her lifetime, because some very influential writers wanted to see more of her work, including Thomas Niles of Roberts Brothers Publishing in Boston, who was the first person to say to Louisa May Alcott, maybe you ought to try a novel about girls. He was very interested in women's writing. So while it's true, Dickinson died in 1886, and the first edition of her poems came out in 1890 to great applause. It immediately went into multiple editions, and I don't think we've ever seen her dip. The great biographer Richard Sewell once said of her, Emily Dickinson is inexhaustible. And I think her relevance for today is just as high as it was at other times during previous century. But she had people knocking on her door, wanting her to publish during her own lifetime, but she resisted that. I think because she saw every poem as alive, and to publish it was to set it in print and to make it dead in a way. Right. That she couldn't go back and continue to work on it. She found it very difficult to let things go. But she's never had a waning period. I think it could be not even in her own lifetime.
Great. I appreciate that correction. Thank you. Fitzgerald, of course, was world famous almost overnight, right?
When I first started teaching, I used to have an analogy where I would tell my students that Fitzgerald was sort of like the Backstreet Boys of his day. He kind of came out as a boy band and had his biggest success early on, and then fell into irrelevance. And the sad thing that's happened over the past 20 years is great for the Backstreet Boys, but the constant reunions of the past, I think. It would have been interesting if he had lived beyond 44. The myth is that he was at the cusp of a certain level of maturation with a novel called the Last Tycoon. Whether he could have pulled that off and reinvented himself as a writer in his 40s, I think the way that Stone probably did in the mid 80s when he was turning around 50, that remains to be seen. But Fitzgerald's great Achilles heel was he romanticized his own failure. And I think that he sort of, I think this is what Madison was kind of referring to in some ways, is he so associated, himself with it almost became like a self-made prophecy that he would end up where he did, which is unfortunate.
I mean, the crack up is one of the scariest texts.
Oh yeah,
he wrote.
Yeah,
that's terrifying. I mean, second to me in Fitzgerald is there's a transcription of a conversation between him, Zelda, and a bunch of psychiatrists.
Yeah,
and that is just scarier than shit, because it's about who gets to tell the story, and it turned out to be him, but he didn't do a very good job in that case.
We call that the Fitzgerald version of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I mean, and we try to keep the casual fan from discovering it because it shatters a lot of illusions. But it is an important.
Well, no, but I mean, I think you see the pain and the reality of that relationship in both of the people.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things about it that were wrong, but they were also characteristic of the time. And we're talking in code here, so we should probably stop.
We're almost done, but there is one other audience question for you, Anthony. It says, when did you begin reading writers of color and become more conscious of your purpose?
Thank you for that. And I can answer that and along the way sort of think about the question of reputation. I also went to public school. I went to a public university for college. And a lot of times, so I'm not so old that by the time I went to college, Black studies was well established. And one of the things that means is that the canon wars were ongoing still. That is, people were still arguing with each other over which authors should be studied. But there was a fairly well established canon of African American writers. And so as soon as I thought that what I wanted to do was write, I started trying to figure out who were the writers who would come before me. And it was easy enough to find names like Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, and just to hear around the table and around in conversation. So I think that for me is organic. But it's also, it's always been a part of how I approached reading, because I knew I would have to read people like Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and I enjoyed them well enough. But that any other reading I would want to do would be what I would seek out. And I was very intentional about that, just listening for names and keeping track of them. And I was fortunate enough to have access to a good library so that I could sustain that interest, the kind of extracurricular curriculum that I gave myself alongside my other studies. I think the institutionalization of the study of African American literature has made it easier to find some authors, but it's still the case that if you want to look for, let's say, the oddballs, people who don't tell the story that's become familiar, that's just a lot of personal research.
All right. Well, let me see. Okay, I thought I had another question. I see no more audience questions. You guys have questions for each other?
What's the price of eggs in China?
Can't help you there.
I was going to ask Madison. This is kind of the question that maybe people hate the most, but was there one question that drove Robert Stone nuts that readers would ask him about, whether that was the Merry Pranksters or about Dog Soldiers? Was there one thing that he sort of resented about his reputation that he wished people would, really tackle and rediscover a different side of him?
I don't think there really was. I mean, he didn't like, since he didn't like being asked about recreational drug use. I mean, I saw when he was at Hopkins, he was sort of set up for that on a stage. He was giving a reading, and there was a cat's paw in the audience who asked him about his own drug use, and he just categorically denied it all. I'm sure, even though a certain amount of it was actually, really rather little of it was on the record. And I was kind of surprised to find out what an enthusiastic consumer of LSD he had in fact been, because Tom Wolfe in the electric Kool-Aid acid test, which is a really very good record of the Kesey group, has him being an outsider and somebody who didn't partake. Well, he was a bit of an outsider. He was a close friend of Kesey's, but he never signed up for the cult. But he did take all the drugs he could get his hands on. And somehow Wolfe came away with the impression that he was not doing that, which was probably helpful, to Bob's later career as an academic, although I think as things that happened in the 60s are generally forgiven. Even in the 90s they were. And I think he didn't like being asked that question because he couldn't answer truthfully.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the one case I ever saw him sort of cornered in a way that he had to perjure himself on stage, and the way that he was set up for that, I think, was also somewhat dishonorable. So that's the only time I saw him be uncomfortable with a question, to answer your question in a very elliptical way.
Kirk, I did think of a question for you. So you were talking about Fitzgerald's short stories, which I love. Mayday, I think, is brilliant. The Jelly Bean is a great story. I remember one of the few things I really remember reading when I was in probably junior high school was Bernice Bobs Her Hair. Why do you think they're not more widely known? Is it just the preference for long fiction over short fiction?
I do think, and Madison, as an acclaimed short story writer, can speak to this. The short story has never really gotten its due compared to the novel. The novel has ambition written all over it, as opposed to the sort of the fine filigree that comes with doing short stories. But I think also he was a commercial short story writer, and
there were some bad ones.
He was writing for a broad marketplace. And I think it's, one of the things we've tried to do is try to reclaim some of those commercial stories like Bernice or the Ice Palace, which is in this collection. Interestingly enough, the presumption is always that if he was a commercial writer, he had to write happy stories. But the fact is, just more stories that he wrote for the Saturday Evening Post end on a somber, sad note. I mean, that was just his character. So, I think that I really credit it to the prejudice against short stories. And Madison might want to speak to that as well.
Well, I think the short story is a beautiful form. It's just not easily commercialized now. In Fitzgerald's day, that was a way to make your career, because people got their bursts of, the half-hour to 2-hour bursts of entertainment came in the short story. Yeah. Now it's TV or film. So it's just been eaten up by that, except for adaptation. But when you were talking about his, huge career as a commercial short story writer, it made me think of Edgar Allan Poe. Mm-hmm. So it'd be an interesting comparison to make, because Poe, we mainly think of the tragic Poe and the horror story Poe, and maybe remember some of the poems, but and possibly, if we're really eclectic, the fact that he invented the detective story. But he was a very energetic hack, Poe. I mean, he ground out all sorts of stuff: humor, satire, Egyptology. And I think, Fitzgerald, I have this vast volume of Fitzgerald stories that I've never had the will to read. And I thank you for kind of winnowing it down in a different way, because I think there are probably more masterpieces there than I know. I know a few. Babylon Revisited has always been a great favorite of mine. And the funny thing about it is that it's predictive. He wrote it before he was in that situation. Yeah. About 5 or 10 years.
There was another question that came in actually about Fitzgerald for you, Kirk. Did you find anything positive in Fitzgerald's fascination with failure?
Well, as much as it hurt him, I think personally and professionally, I think a lot of if you think of his major theme as being the discrepancy between aspiration and realization. I mean, we wouldn't have Great Gatsby if it weren't for his fascination with failure. I mean, would we really want a novel about a guy who actually did make a lot of money illegally and win the girl of his dreams? And one of my favorite quotes is from Umberto Eco, and he said, literature is for losers. And I love that, because it really captures the idea that, part of the job that we teach or that we struggle with, as opposed to business writing or any other kind of writing, is really to lament and to mourn and to give voice to those darker things. I mean, we wouldn't want Emily Dickinson to be a greeting card writer. I mean, that would just destroy the thing that we cherish most about that darkness. So it's essential to his aesthetics, And I think that you have to separate what it did to him personally as opposed to what he was able to accomplish.
We have another question, but I'm trying to get a sense of how the timing here works, whether we should take the question or wrap up. So I think actually that's a good note to end our session on. Literature is for losers. That's a great message for the Southern Festival of Books. But I understand your point. I want to thank all of our authors.
No, here's the thing. Everybody's a loser. There's only, the winners are the 1%, right?
That's a way to put it.
Losers can be a great audience for each other. That's what we need to do.
Which, I want to thank our audience, although we can't see them. I imagine they're out there, and I want to thank them. And I want to remind them and everyone to sponsor the Southern Festival of Books. It's a great thing, either virtually or in person, hopefully in person next year. But I want to thank everybody for joining us, and hope you will attend some further events at the festival and support Humanities Tennessee. Thank you all.
Thanks, Adam.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh.